They laughed at the ranchers' Apache brides, until their English and a governor's seal stopped the town cold. The air above Milbrook shimmered like hammered copper. By mid-afternoon the red dust hung so thick it turned every breath into a chore, and the heat pressed down, as if the sun had settled just above the rooftops. The townsfolk moved slower than usual, but when a lone rider appeared at the far end of the main street, spines straightened and hands shaded eyes. The horse came first, a big roan coated in travel-stained sweat. The rider followed. Sterling Maddox, rancher from the southern flats, a man with sun-cracked knuckles and a reputation for working hard and saying little. Behind him rode 3 women in single file, each straight-backed on slim desert ponies, their silhouettes dark against the glare. From a distance they could have been any 3 Apache wives, braided hair, buckskin skirts, beads glinting at their throats, yet there was something in the way they carried themselves that unsettled the crowd. Their posture was soldier straight, their faces calm but intent, eyes scanning everything with the stillness of hawks. Milbrook had never seen anything like them. By the time Sterling drew up outside the courthouse, the boardwalk was lined with curious onlookers. Whispers rippled through the shade of the awning. Maddox gone loco brought home a whole squad of Apache brides. Apache don't sit a horse like that. Look at their eyes. Not shy, not scared, just watchin'. Sterling swung down, dust swirling at his boots. The 3 women dismounted as one, smooth and unhurried. Their skirts brushed the ground like soft wings. They never spoke. Not to Sterling, not to each other, not to the townsfolk whose stares grew sharper by the second. For 3 mornings now, the blacksmith had seen Sterling sitting outside his rented room at dawn, bent over a leather-bound journal, slowly scratching symbols on the page. The strangest part, everyone knew Sterling barely wrote his own name. No one could explain who was teaching him or why the women always watched as he worked, heads inclined as if judging each stroke of his pen. Mayor Crawford elbowed through the crowd, his face blotched from heat and tobacco. "Maddox, what in blazes you think you're doing bringing these creatures into my courthouse? Come to register my marriages," Sterling said, voice steady as sun-baked fence posts. "Same right any man's got." The statement drew a burst of rough laughter. Women clutched their children closer. Men shook their heads in disbelief. The 3 silent brides stood like carved obsidian, unblinking, memorizing each sneer and jeer as though filing evidence for a trial only they understood. Crawford spat a brown streak into the dust at Sterling's boots. "You can't marry savages. They don't even grasp what marriage means." The tallest woman tilted her head almost imperceptibly. Sterling noticed. So did a few sharp-eyed townsfolk. A subtle drumming of her fingers against the beaded seam of her skirt followed too precise to be idle. "I got papers," Sterling said, and drew folded documents from his vest. "Drawn up proper." Crawford snatched them, squinting at the neat handwriting. "Who wrote this for you, Maddox? This penmanship's finer than any ranch hand's." Sterling's gaze slid sideways toward the women. The tallest gave the smallest twitch at the corner of her mouth, half a smile, half a warning. The second, a silver-threaded braid over her shoulder, kept her dark eyes fixed on the mayor, reading every insult as though she understood each word. The youngest clutched a small beaded pouch at her waist. Inside it lay a folded letter whose contents would eventually change the course of more than one life. The crowd's muttering swelled, brittle as the wind-dried grass. The youngest woman stepped forward, fierce intelligence burning behind her composure. She opened her mouth, closed it again, shot a glance at her companions, then reached into the pouch and produced the letter. She handed it to Sterling with a calm that seemed far older than her years. Whatever truth hid in that letter remained unopened for the moment, pressed between Sterling's calloused fingers like a live coal waiting to burn. That was the day Milbrook's unspoken rule that Apache women never spoke English, never met a white man's eye fractured like glass under boot heel. And it was also the day a different stranger, riding the northern trail under the same cruel sun, would unknowingly cross their fate. Sterling didn't open the letter in front of Mayor Crawford. He waited until the women who finally gave their names as Lena, Mika, and Tessa sat with him on the back stoop of the boarding house. Inside was a single sheet, creamy and official, bearing the seal of the territorial governor and a countersignature from the Surveyor General's office. It named Aro Tawa as the lawful heir to the claim under dispute with Thorn Mining, and it listed the serial numbers of 3 original field maps currently in transit to Carson City. "Where'd you get this?" Sterling whispered. "From the convent in San Francisco," Tessa said in precise English that made him blink. "We studied there. Arrow was a term mate. When word reached Sister Agnes that Thorn's men were falsifying surveys, she sent us east with the governor's reply and copies of the notary's affidavits. You're riding north tomorrow, Mr. Maddox. You'll carry us and this letter as far as Humboldt Station. From there we take the coach to Carson City." Sterling stared at the 3 women Chiricahua by blood, convent taught by necessity, and unafraid. He wasn't the teacher after all. He was the escort. The northern trail cut through a country that looked baked from the inside out. Cracked clay, mesquite skeletons, dry washes carved by flash floods that hadn't come in years. The rider there was Jedediah Stone, though the wanted posters once called him Grizzly Stone. Broad-shouldered, half-feral from too many miles alone, he rode a swayback dun gelding named Rags. On his left shoulder, an old cavalry scar ached in the heat, a jagged relic of a Sierra Nevada ambush that had wiped out his unit and most of his honor. Stone had been a bounty hunter these past 10 years, chasing small-time outlaws for just enough coin to stay fed, never for glory. This day he followed the dust print of a horse thief called Little Pete, bound toward the mining outpost of Dust Devil Pass. 3 days without a decent word spoken or a drink that wasn't warm as bathwater had soured his temper to iron. Dust Devil Pass was no real town, only a scab of shacks clinging to a silver vein in the arid Utah territory. The sun there beat so hard the sweat dried to salt before it could cool a man's neck. Stone tied Rags outside the one building, pretending to authority a clapboard structure doing triple duty as general store, post office and lawyer's office, and pushed through its warped swinging doors. Inside, the desert wind's shriek died to a muffled hush. A single kerosene lamp threw long yellow blades of light over rough-hewn tables. The air smelled of ink, cheap whiskey, and imminent trouble. Stone's eyes adjusted fast, a soldier's eyes always did. At the center of the room stood a thick-necked man in an expensive but sweat-stained city suit, Baron Silas Thorn, local mining magnate and predator by reputation. His fat, jeweled finger tapped an official-looking document on the table. Across from him, rigid with dignity despite the crumpled travel dress she wore, stood a young woman with high Shoshone Paiute cheekbones and the steady, defiant gaze of someone raised to read both books and mountains. Her name, Stone would later learn, was Aro Tawa. "Sign it, girl," Thorn said in a voice heavy with ownership. "Quit. Claim deeds as simple as your father's scratch of dirt. Thorn Mining's always owned that vein, you're just holding up progress." Aro clutched a small, worn ledger to her chest as if it were a shield. "My father filed his claim with the Surveyor General. The silver vein is ours." Thorn's chuckle was dry and mean. "Surveyor, General's 600 miles away, child, and your father's 6 feet under. Law cares for the man with the better lawyer." He seized her wrist and jammed a pen between her fingers. "Sign or be thrown off for trespassing on my land, and your father's memory alike." Stone hated the sound of a woman cornered. He hated it more when the corner man wore a rich man's ring. Without thinking, he crossed the distance in 3 silent strides and clamped a hand scarred, broad as a spade around Thorn's wrist. The fat man yelped, dropping both pen and papers. "Who the devil are you?" Thorn snapped, jerking back. The answer came like gravel ground in a dry throat. "Jedediah Stone. And you're done with her." Arrow's eyes flicked to him relief and new fear mingling there. She recognized danger when she saw it. Stone was no savior, just another wolf who'd decided which prey to bite. Thorn blustered about civil interference, about the law being on his side. Stone's gaze stayed flat and cold. "This ain't law. This is bullion. You want the silver, see a judge, or face me." 2 hired guns near the door shifted uneasily at the quiet threat that carried more weight than a shout. After a tense beat, Thorn straightened his tie and backed off, spitting promises of revenge. For Aro Tawa, That moment marked the first crack in the walls closing around her. For Stone, it was the first step onto a road he hadn't meant to walk, the road toward redemption he thought forever lost in the Sierra Nevada snows. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Thorne's retreat was only for the moment. The Baron left behind a stench of whiskey sweat and wounded pride that clung to the room after his boots quit the floorboards. Stone holstered his Colt, nodded once to the girl whose pulse still beat wild beneath the thin skin of her wrist, and turned to go. He'd come for Little Pete's bounty, not a silver mine feud. But Tawa stepped into his path. "You can't just walk away," she said, voice soft, words precise, as if she'd learned them from a book, but weighted each one with lived defiance. "He'll send men. He owns the deputy, maybe the judge too. I have proof of my father's claim, ledgers, letters, official seals, but I can't live long enough to reach the territorial court alone." Stone leaned a shoulder against the door jamb, studying her as a hawk studies the rabbit that bites back. "Lady, my job's to fetch a horse thief. Your fight's with a rich bully and his lawyers. Not my concern." Something in her eyes changed, not anger, but calculation. "The thief you're chasing left 2 hours ago, north toward the Humboldt, bought a fresh horse. I know his trail." She held his gaze steadily. "You're chasing dollars. I'm chasing justice. We could trade." That pricked Stone's interest more than he'd admit. He spat into the spittoon, slow. "Justice, don't pay bills. Lad. I can pay in something better than dollars," she said. "I know names. I know where one of the men responsible for the Sierra Nevada ambush is hiding." Stone's whole frame went still. The ambush, the massacre that had carved the scar down his chest and hollowed the faith out of his bones, was the one ghost he still hunted. Arrow had just laid bait for the only quarry he truly wanted. They struck a bargain without ceremony. He'd be her shield to Carson City. In return, once her claim was safe, she'd tell him the name. That night, the desert wind rose to a constant shriek. Dust Devil Pass vanished beneath a choking red storm that clawed at shutters and scoured paint from signs. Thorne's answer to his humiliation arrived with it. A warrant nailed crooked on the lawyer's office door, charge of interference with private enterprise and assault on a businessman. Price on Stone's head, $50 and local gratitude. By dawn, the sky was the color of rusted iron. Arrow had tied a bandana over her face and sat astride a tired bay mare. Stone mounted Rags. They pushed west into the teeth of the storm toward a shack Arrow claimed stood near her father's silver claim, a place to hole up until the wind calmed. Riding through that storm was like wading blindfolded through ground glass. Grit bit into every fold of clothing. The horses lowered their heads and pushed on doggedly. Arrow, despite the convent dress now dulled to storm brown, rode as though born to the saddle, her body's rhythm matching the mare's weary stride. They reached the shack at dusk, half dug into a hillside, timber, roofed, smelling of old ore and mice. Arrow spread her father's ledger across a crate that served as a table. By lamplight, its pages revealed more than mineral tallies, letters bearing seals of notaries public, even one from a territorial governor warning of Thorne's earlier bribery attempts. Arrow's father had understood the law and had prepared his daughter to wield it. "He sent me to the convent in San Francisco," she explained, seeing Stone's raised brow at her refined diction. "He said the land would need the white man's words to defend it." Stone sat in the shadowed corner cleaning his revolver. "Law's one thing," he said gruffly. "Men with rifles another. Thorne won't argue statutes. He'll send killers." Arrow looked at the weapon, then at him. "Your honor is the better weapon, Mr. Stone. You stopped him because it was right, not for money. That's the man I need, one who stands because he can't stomach the wrong." He almost laughed low and bitter. "Don't mistake my temper for virtue." She didn't answer, only kept reading by lamplight, while outside the dust keened across the scrub like a restless ghost. Near midnight, hoofbeats came muffled by the storm. Stone signaled her to silence and slipped outside, a shadow among shadows. Two riders moved slow through the murk, Thorne's hirelings scouting for blood. Stone took them down without gunfire, one flattened by the butt of his Colt, the other silenced by a hammer fist to the jaw. Both would wake sore, unarmed, and humiliated, Left tied to a post till daylight. Message sent. Back inside, Arrow was huddled on her bedroll, but her eyes tracked his every movement. Are they? Alive, he said, wiping grit from his knuckles. Empty-handed, too. That's the language Thorn understands. Something shifted in her expression then, not just gratitude, but the beginning of trust. Dawn broke brittle and cold. The storm had spent itself, leaving the desert scoured clean beneath a hard blue sky. They saddled the horses in silence. The partnership no longer needed words. Arrow guided them westward through dry washes and broken canyons toward a hidden Shoshone refuge, a cave she said few outsiders knew. By noon, they reached a narrow fissure in a red rock wall. Inside lay a limestone chamber, daubed with ancient pictographs of hunt, and Sunday, Arrow built a smokeless sage fire, its scent cut through dust and sweat. Stone stripped off his coat and winced his old lance. Scar had reopened from the ride. She noticed. That wasn't a bullet, she said quietly, kneeling with salve and clean cloth from her saddlebag. A blade, a war lance. Sierra Nevada 10 years back, he admitted. Was supposed to guard a supply train. Ambush wiped out the lot. I crawled away half dead. Been trying to balance the ledger ever since. She cleaned the wound gently. You've been punishing yourself for surviving. He said nothing. The crackle of sage filled the pause. I know what it is to live between two worlds, she added at last. The convent taught me Latin prayers and corsets. My father taught me treaty law and how to read the land. White folk use me for my schooling. My own people distrust the dresses I wear. Fighting for my father's honor means standing alone. For a long time, neither spoke. The desert night pressed close outside the cave mouth. 2 wounded lives had found a kind of truce beside a small, smokeless fire. You asked what you'd get for protecting me, she said finally, tying the bandage firm. You'll get the chance to finish what you started in the mountains, prove to yourself you can save, not just avenge. Before Stone could answer, a pebble skittered down from the fissure above. Hoof scrape on rock, followed searchers again. Arrow caught his sleeve, eyes bright with a plan. The path below ends at a drop-off to the left. Let me walk out where they can see me, draw them forward. You circle up the rocks behind. He shook his head. Too risky. You want justice. Trust my knowledge of this land. We fight as partners or not at all. Reluctantly he nodded and scaled the rocks. Arrow pulled her bandana over her face, stepped into dawn's pale light as a lone figure against the red wall. The approaching riders focused on her as she'd predicted. Stone dropped on them from above, swift and silent. Moments later, the canyon was empty again, save for 2 more trussed-up emissaries of the Baron. They left the sacred cave as the sun rose higher, their unspoken covenant sealed by shared cunning and the first real taste of victory. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The first 2 days out of the Red Rock Canyons were nothing but wind and silence. Stone set a steady pace that ate the miles. Arrow rode alongside without complaint, her skirt gathered up for the saddle, her city, school posture softening into the relaxed sway of a woman born to the trail. The desert night fell sudden and sharp. Frost glittered on their blankets at dawn. They talked little at first. Trust still had to be earned, mile by mile. By the 3rd evening, camped under a stunted cottonwood beside a shallow wash, Arrow stirred beans over a tiny blue flame while Stone crouched near the horses, oiling the Henry rifle. Thorn wants you to lose your temper, she said quietly. If you kill him, he wins. We have to beat him with the very laws he twists. Stone looked up from the rifle, face shadowed by the dying light. Feels wrong letting a rattler like that breathe. Her dark eyes met his across the small fire. Sometimes the harder fight is to keep your hand off the trigger. The words stuck under his skin. His life had been measured in the weight of a gun. The idea that real strength might be the choice not to fire was new and unsettling. On the trail, she taught him things too. How to tell legitimate land deeds from forged surveys. How miners' codes differed from territorial law. Why the ledger mattered. In return, he showed her the ways of the high desert, where to dig for seep water in a dry wash, how to sight a rifle against mountain winds, How to keep utterly still when the coyotes went silent at dusk because something larger was prowling. The miles forged a quiet partnership. The silence between them shifted from wary to companionable. Each began to listen for the other's breathing at night the way soldiers do on campaign. Carson City rose at last out of the sage hills like a promise of civilization. Clean board, walks, a real telegraph office, a courthouse with tall windows that caught the morning Sunday. Arrow straightened in the saddle at the sight. Stone's eyes narrowed, suspicious of any place that smelled of ink and fresh, cut pine. To her it was an arena. To him it was enemy ground. They arrived trail-stained and road-weary, drawing stares on the main street, an educated Shoshone woman leading a bay mare beside a scarred gunman, with a look of unfinished business in his eyes. The clerk at the courthouse sniffed at their dust, but, after hearing Arrow's precise diction and seeing the careful ledger, agreed to schedule a hearing. Word spread quickly. By the time their case was called, the courtroom benches were crowded with miners in soot-black shirts, townsfolk in Sunday coats, a few soldiers on furlough curious for drama. Baron Thorne was already there, dressed in a fresh black coat, sweat-slick hair combed flat, sitting beside a hawk-faced lawyer whose spectacles flashed like bayonet steel. When Stone's shadow filled the doorway, Thorne's smile twisted. "Well, the drifter who should have been hanged in the desert. You're late, Judge has heard the truth already." Stone said nothing. He simply moved to stand behind Arrow's chair, arms folded loosely, the very image of a wall built for her protection. Judge Harlan, a lean old man whose eyes carried the fatigue of decades spent watching men buy verdicts, presided. The proceedings opened with Thorne's lawyer unrolling survey maps and producing deeds that claimed the Tawa silver vein lay inside Thorne mining boundaries and that the Tawa claim had been abandoned for years. The presentation sounded official. The crowd murmured approval. Arrow rose when her turn came. She looked small beneath the high bench, yet spoke with a calm authority that silenced the room. "Your Honor, the deeds presented rely on a falsified survey map. The original boundary recorded 10 years ago places the vein beyond Thorne's line. My father, Chief Tawa's son, filed annual yields and taxes in this ledger." She laid the worn book on the rail, her fingers steady. Within are also 3 notarized letters and 1 sealed reply from the territorial governor warning of Mr. Thorne's attempts at coercion. The lawyer laughed sharply. "A handwritten ledger by a native girl? This is not legal evidence." Arrow's reply was cool, precise. When the handwriting is confirmed by 3 white notaries public and accompanied by the governor's own seal, it is exactly legal evidence. The crowd stirred. Even the judge leaned forward. The picture of a frightened savage crumbled. In its place stood an educated, well-prepared heir defending her father's honor with the law itself. Frustration curdled Thorne's composure. He surged from his chair with a growl, lunging to snatch the ledger from Arrow's hands. Stone moved faster, 1 step forward, shoulders squared, eyes gone hard as the mountains. He didn't have to draw his Colt. The sudden wall of him, and the low growl that escaped his throat, froze the Baron mid-lunge. For a heartbeat the room held its breath. Judge Harlan's gavel cracked down. "Order. Another such outburst and you'll be held in contempt, Baron Thorne." The lawyer muttered protests, but the damage was done. The jurist's eyes now lingered on Arrow's evidence, not on Thorne's maps. The rear doors swung open. Dusty from the road, yet composed, Lena, Mika, and Tessa entered the courtroom with a leather tube and a sealed envelope. The bailiff took them to the clerk. The clerk's eyebrows shot up at the governor's seal. Arrow turned, recognition flickering to relief. "Classmates," she breathed. The clerk unrolled the original field map. Its boundary line placed the vein beyond Thorne's claim. The notarized affidavits matched entries in Arrow's ledger line for line. Thorne's lawyer began to protest, then saw the seal and swallowed the words. The judge compared signatures, dates, and survey bearings. Each landed like a nail in a coffin. After a tense half-hour of questioning and rebuttals, the gavel struck again. "The injunction against the Tawa claim is denied," Judge Harlan ruled, his voice suddenly firm. "Further, there is sufficient suggestion of fraud by Thorne Mining to warrant investigation. Baron Thorne, You will remain in custody pending inquiry." A ripple of astonished applause and gasps ran through the spectators. Arrow let out a slow breath that trembled only at the edges. Stone didn't smile, but the set of his shoulders eased. His presence behind her chair had been enough, his silence more potent than a drawn gun. As the bailiff led Thorne away, the Baron twisted to snarl one last threat. "You can't guard her forever, Stone. I have friends. You'll both hang before spring." Stone's gaze met his, flat and unblinking, until the doors swung shut behind the defeated Baron. On the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun caught the dust in Arrow's dark hair like sparks of copper. She stood a moment looking at the sky as if tasting freedom for the first time in months. A single tear traced a clean path down her cheek. "We did it, Jedediah," she said, almost a whisper. "For my father, for the land, we truly did." Stone studied the busy street below, wagons creaking past, men tipping hats to the newly famous Shoshone woman and the silent gunman at her side. "We bought a promise," he said quietly. "Not peace. A man like Thorne never stops fighting until the dirt's over him." But for the first time in years, as he looked at Arrow, tired, dust-streaked, but standing straight beneath the fading sunlight, Stone felt the ghost of something he thought long buried, the sense that maybe the fight could be worth more than the bullet. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." Carson City did not stay kind for long. For a few short days after the courtroom victory, Arrow Tawa walked the streets lighter on her feet. Ledger safely stored in the clerk's vault, the townsfolk nodding to her with a mixture of curiosity and new-won respect. Stone, ever the outsider, kept mostly to the livery and the porch of the boarding house. Boot heels, hooked on the rail, eyes on the street, as if expecting the sound of hoofbeats to announce trouble. Trouble came anyway, without the drum of hooves. A week after the verdict, a breathless deputy burst into the sheriff's office with a telegram. Baron Thorne had escaped custody on the road to Virginia City. 2 guards beaten, 1 thrown into a ravine. The Baron was riding free with half a dozen hired guns, and his first words overheard in the saloon were said to be, "The girl and the drifter die first." Arrow heard the news while standing in front of the courthouse steps. Her spine stiffened, but she did not flinch. She had learned long ago that fear was wasted on a man like Thorne. Stone was less restrained. He slammed his palm flat against the porch rail, hard enough to rattle the spittoon. "Told you the snake wouldn't stay in a box," he muttered. That evening they sat opposite each other in a small rented room above the general store, the oil lamp hissing softly between them. Outside, the street hummed with wagon wheels and piano music from the saloon. Inside, the air was thick with things unsaid. "He won't go back to the courtroom," Arrow said finally. "He'll come for us. To him, this isn't about silver anymore. He needs to break what humiliated him." Stone nodded once, the scar at his collarbone pulling tight. "Then we move before he does." They left Carson City 2 mornings later, under a brittle dawn sky, heading west into the pine-belted foothills. Stone guided them to a hunter's cabin he knew from older days. 1 room of rough-hewn logs, a smoke, darkened hearth, and the lingering scent of dried pelts and cold iron traps. It sat in a narrow valley ringed by tall lodge poles, where the wind sang through the needles like a river of whispers. For the first time since the courtroom fight, they allowed themselves to breathe. Arrow unpacked her father's ledger, wrapped now in oilcloth to protect it from mountain damp, and set it on the mantel as though the old book were a sentinel keeping watch. Stone stacked wood by the door and checked the door bar and window latch with a soldier's fussiness. The scar on his shoulder ached in the night chill, but he made no complaint. The days at the cabin followed a quiet rhythm. Arrow boiled coffee thick as tar in the mornings and wrote neat notes in the margin of the ledger by afternoon light. Stone split logs, repaired the leaking chink in the north wall, cleaned the colt with almost religious precision. Neither spoke much, Yet the silence was not hostile, merely the silence of two people who had learned to conserve words the way travelers conserve water. At dusk, they sometimes sat on the small porch, each with a tin cup warming their hands, watching the last light smear crimson through the tall trees. Coyotes called from far slopes, an owl's wing cut the sky. It was a peace so thin they dared not name it aloud. One evening, Arrow noticed dark seepage on the shoulder seam of Stone's shirt. "You're bleeding again," she said quietly. "Old wound," he replied dismissive. She fetched clean cloth and a small tin of salve from her saddlebag, medicine her father had taught her to make from pine resin and sage. As she peeled the fabric away, she traced the scar that slashed across his chest, her touch light, almost reverent. "That was no bullet," she murmured. "A lance wound. Apache? Sierra Nevada, 10 years back," he admitted. "I was cavalry then. Our unit was escorting a supply train through the pass. We were ambushed. Everyone died but me. I crawled out half dead, been trying to balance the ledger ever since." Arrow pressed the salve gently into the ragged line of flesh. "You didn't survive to run, you survived because you were left for dead. You've been punishing yourself for not dying with them." Stone's jaw worked, but he didn't answer. The only sound was the pop of resin in the hearth fire. "I know what it is to live between two worlds," she went on softly. "The convent taught me Latin hymns and the posture of a lady. My father taught me the old laws of the land and how to read the wind on the hills. The white town uses me for my schooling. My own people eye my dress and doubt my loyalty. I came back to fight for my father's honor and found only Thorn's contempt. We both walk with ghosts." She tied the bandage neatly and sat back on her heels. "You asked what you'd get for guarding me," she said. "Maybe it's not gold you need, Jedediah. Maybe it's the chance to save instead of avenge." For a long time he studied the fire. "Maybe," he said at last, the single word rough as gravel yet softer than she'd ever heard it from him. A week of thin peace passed. The first snow fell over the meadow, muffling hoofprints and laying a pale hush on the pines. Arrow cooked stews from dried venison left by the hunter. Stone set snares and mended tack. The routines of survival drew them into a wordless companionship that felt older than courtrooms or silver veins. But news traveled even to the quiet valley. A passing trapper brought word of riders asking after a scarred drifter and a Shoshone woman, last seen near the Truckee crossing. Thorn's reach was lengthening. That night they packed while the storm rattled the shutters. "We can't stay," Stone said. "If we hole up here, we'll be picked off one night or wake to the roof on fire." "Oh." Arrow looked at the ledger on the mantel, then at him. "Then we leave. My father's claim is safe in the court records. The mine itself isn't worth dying in a cabin for." "Where do you want to go?" he asked. "West," she replied, "to the valleys where my people still hold land. I can use the money from the sale of the claim to build a school, maybe even hire a lawyer to help them keep what's theirs. We don't owe the silver anything more." Stone considered her words, then gave a slow nod. "We'll sell to your Paiute cooperative, take only what we need, and ride before the thaw." The following evening by the hearth, Arrow approached him carrying a folded slip of paper. "I kept my word," she said, holding it out. "This is the name of the man who rode with the raiders in the Sierra Nevada, the one you've been hunting all these years." He looked at the paper, but made no move to take it. "You really believe I still need that? You've crossed half the territory chasing that name," she reminded him gently. Stone reached out at last, pinched the paper between two fingers, and without unfolding it fed it straight into the fire. The edges curled, blackened, turned to drifting ash. Arrow stared at the ashes. "Why?" "I chased him to prove I was worth the breath I stole on that mountain," Stone said, voice low but steady. "But standing in that courtroom beside you, that proved it better than a corpse ever could. I don't need his blood anymore." For the first time since the ambush, he felt the knot in his chest loosen, as though a weight had slid from his back into the flames with the paper. Arrow's expression softened, almost luminous in the firelight. "Then perhaps," she said, "we're both free now." Their decision to leave came easy after that. At dawn they rode down to Carson City, signed a deed transferring the silver claim to the Paiute Community Fund Arrow had organized, and placed the ledger copy with a lawyer she trusted. They traded most of Stone's bounty hunter gear for supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, a stronger bay mare for Arrow. Stone kept only the Colt and his old Henry rifle. Weapons now for protection, not revenge. The night before their departure, snowflakes sifted down like scattered ashes from a burned-out past. They sat by the dying fire, cups of black coffee warming their hands. Arrow asked quietly, "Do you ever think about peace, about what lies after all this running?" Stone stared into the embers. "A man's peace don't come from the ground he's standing on. Comes from the weight he finally lays down. Think I laid mine aside tonight." She leaned her head against his broad shoulder, blanket drawn around both their backs. The gesture needed no more words. "If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters." The morning they left Carson City, the snow on the pines melted into pearl-bright drops that glittered like small blessings. Stone loaded the last sack of flour. Arrow tied the ledger bundle to her new mare's saddle. She had decided to keep the ledger not as proof for the courts anymore, but as a memory of her father's fight for the land. They set out at sunrise, hooves crunching the frosted ground, breath of the horses steaming in the brittle air. Behind them, the mountains held their secrets. Before them stretched the long sage plains that led west toward the California border and the river valleys where Arrow hoped to build something lasting for her people. Stone rode silent as ever, but the silence had softened. It was no longer the heavy hush of a man crushed by ghosts, but the measured quiet of one who'd finally laid the ghosts to rest. Arrow rode beside him easily now, her city-taught posture blending with the horsewoman's sway she'd inherited from her Shoshone blood. They stopped at a rise above the valley. From there, the trail wound down like a pale ribbon through gold-brown sage. Stone rested a hand on his saddle horn, scanning the horizon the way soldiers do. "You see something?" Arrow asked. "Just habit," he said. "A man don't lose the sense of being hunted." "Oh." As if on cue, a lone rider appeared far behind them on a distant ridge small as an inkblot against the sky, astride a dark horse. The figure sat motionless for a long minute, then turned downslope, vanishing among the folds of land. Arrow's fingers tightened on her reins. Thorn? Maybe. Maybe just another wanderer with his own ghosts. Stone answered, voice unreadable. Then he turned his horse downslope. "Either way, we keep riding. This one." They pressed on without looking back, the wind lifting strands of Arrow's dark hair across her cheek. That evening they camped near a bend of the Truckee River. The sky went red-gold, then bruised purple. The first stars pricked out as if watching their small fire. They boiled coffee, shared jerky, and watched the water run black under the starlight. "Do you ever regret throwing that name in the fire?" Arrow asked quietly. Stone shook his head. "No. If I'd gone after him, I'd still be the same man who left his company to die in the mountains. I wanted to prove I could save somebody worth saving. I did." Her gaze softened. "Then you saved me, and in some way, yourself." For the first time in years, he let himself believe her. Days later, they crossed into Paiute country, where Arrow was greeted with cautious respect. She met with elders beneath a cottonwood stand, speaking in both English and her people's tongue, proposing to use the silver sale funds for a school and a small legal aid office to help Native families keep their land. Stone waited outside the circle of talk, patient, watching her with a faint expression that almost passed for pride. That night, as they camped beyond the village, Arrow broke the companionable silence. "My father dreamed of a bridge between worlds. I used to think that dream died with him, but maybe that bridge is built not from laws or gold, but from people who refuse to give up." Stone poked at the campfire with a stick. "Reckon bridges need both banks to stand. Guess I can be the plank in the middle if you'll have me." She laughed softly, an unguarded sound he realized he'd been waiting to hear. Spring crept across the high desert. They followed trails westward, past almond groves blooming pale against red soil, over low passes where the wind smelled of the sea. They worked where they could, mending fences for a rancher one week, guiding a wagon train across a tricky ford the next saving coin, moving steadily toward the rugged frontier valleys Arrow remembered from childhood stories. Wherever they went, word of their courtroom stand traveled ahead. The Shoshone woman who beat a mining baron at his own game, the scarred rider who guarded her without firing a shot. In a land used to gun justice, the tale carried its own kind of power. One evening in the Sierra foothills, they made camp under giant cedars. A storm rumbled distant over the peaks, flashes of silver lightning giving brief halos to the trees. Arrow watched the sky a long time. "Feels like the end of a chapter," she said. Stone looked across the fire at her. "Then tomorrow we start the next." They sat in companionable silence until the fire sank to embers and the